Okay. Alejandra, are you okay? We get started?
Yeah, let's do it.
Awesome. Well, welcome everybody. Thank you. Good afternoon. Thanks for joining us. My name is Ellen Miller. I use she, her pronouns, and I am the pro bono manager at the National Immigrant Justice Center. For those of you that don't know, NIJC's pro bono program serves immigrants from more than 90 countries around the world. We have a staff of about 140 and a pro bono network of about 2,000 pro bono attorneys. And all of these people need to communicate. Oftentimes, too, we need to communicate about issues that are not really easy to talk about because a lot of the immigrants are here in the United States, have suffered in their path to get to the US and continue to suffer certain discriminations and incidences even within the country's borders. As a nonprofit organization, we could not do our work without a volunteer language support network. And we know our partner law firms also depend extensively on language support. So you are a critical piece of this network. Thanks for being here. We're excited to have Alejandra Oliva. She's going to be guiding us through some tips and tricks today for working with pro bono clients and with the attorneys. Alejandra also has fascinating and inspiring insight on social justice issues, also with interpretation. So we're grateful to hear that. We have left some time at the end for Q&A to hear your curiosities and questions about pro bono interpretation. Just a few housekeeping things. We are right now recording the Zoom presentation. We'll record up until the Q&A. As long as I can remember, I'll shut off the recording right at the Q&A part so we can speak freely there. And we'll have the recorded presentation on our website within a few days. As this is a Zoom meeting, please control your own mute button. Okay, so please be muted during the presentation. We would also suggest, just so that people aren't distracted, to turn off your cameras during the presentation, if that's possible. And then when you're back on for Q&A, feel free to come back on for the fun conversation. And during the conversation, the presentation, you can also use the chat feature to ask any questions. I want to make sure that this chat feature works. So why don't y'all drop in the chat if you've worked with NIJC before? And if you have, drop in, any comment, how many clients you've worked with or what kind of case you worked on. Please, no client information. And if you haven't yet engaged, are you looking forward to getting involved? So drop some chats in right now and let's see who's with us today. Okay. Jasenia, we're excited to have you and grateful that you're here today. Anybody else's chat feature working? Hey, Lisa and Grace. Oh, Patricia, thank you so much for working on the case that you are right now. We're excited to have you and we hope it's going well. Okay, on the other side, I see. Okay, Maida, you have worked with, okay, great. So it looks like we have some mixed experience here, and we're excited to have everybody. Glad to see that the chat feature works. That means that y'all can drop your questions and curiosities as we go, okay? But without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to Alejandra to walk us through these tips and tricks.
Great. Hi, everyone. Welcome, and thank you so much for coming. I'm really excited to be chatting with you guys today. We're going to be talking about working as a translator or interpreter with the National Immigrant Justice Center, as Ellen mentioned, and that can be for people who are either coming in from outside organizations or on their own to be part of our sort of interpreter network, or it can be folks who are already working as professional staff at one of our pro bono partner orgs who are getting pulled in to do interpretation with them. So it's a little bit of both. I'll be talking a little bit about differences or similarities between the two positions. So if you could go to the next slide, thank you. We are the National Immigrant Justice Center. We are dedicated to ensuring human rights protections and access to justice for all immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. We have offices in Chicago, Indiana, San Diego, and DC. And through those offices, we provide direct legal services and we advocate for immigrant populations through policy reform, impact litigation, and public education. Since its founding 3 decades ago, NIJC has been unique in blending individual client advocacy with broad-based systemic change. And I am not exaggerating that translation and interpretation is a part of every single one of those activities that we take part of. Today we're going to be talking about interpretation and translation. We're going to start with key terms, so we have a foundation of the same terms and languages, and we don't get too jargony. We'll be talking about who NIJC's clients are and what makes working with them unique. And talking about the interpreter and translator's code of ethics, which is particularly important as a lot of these conversations and the work that you would be doing as an interpreter with NIJC happen within legal spaces. And it's just really important to sort of know what you're getting into. From there, we're going to jump right into what a meeting will look like, from preparing to it, to how to introduce yourself, and common issues that can crop up while you're in the middle of interpreting, as well as just some basic do's and don'ts. And then we'll have some time for questions at the end. So to start with the key terms, these all kind of come in pairs, so we'll just kind of go through them really quickly. So we've got the source and the target language. The source language is the language you're translating from. The target language is the language you're translating to. The next 2 terms you'll hear used interchangeably in a lot of spaces and a lot of people. I've tried to keep them as sort of separate as I can in this presentation, but it's really, really common to sort of get them mixed up. But interpretation, strictly speaking, is the relaying of verbal or visual messages from a source language to a target language without adding, subtracting, or changing anything. While translation facilitates textual communication by rendering a text written in a source language into a target language. So if somebody's asking you to translate, somebody's asking you to interpret, check in, ask to see if you're going to be working with documents or people, because people use those 2 terms really interchangeably. And then we have simultaneous interpretation and consecutive interpretation. So simultaneous interpretation is what you might think of if you think of like a UN translator or someone. It's someone with a headset who is translating almost at the same time as the person speaking. There's very little space between to allow for interpretation or translation to be happening. It is quite tricky to do. And so most of what you will be doing is what's called consecutive interpretation, which is when one person speaks, the interpreter interprets, another person speaks, the interpreter interprets, and you have sort of breaks in the conversation to allow for interpretation to happen. Then the next term is probably the most important one we're going to go over, which is language justice. This is an evolving framework based on the notion of respecting every individual's fundamental language rights, to be able to communicate, understand, and be understood in the language in which they prefer and feel most articulate and powerful. This is the framework that I've kind of used to prepare this training, and language justice is also something that you absolutely help to contribute to when you work as a volunteer interpreter for NIJC. Language justice is this really foundational piece of justice, or thing that you need to achieve other kinds of justice. When people are able to feel comfortable in the language they're speaking in, when they feel comfortable telling their stories, that they know that they're being heard and understood by their communities, by their teams, by the people they're working with, that plays a huge role in helping to set out a baseline of justice to be established. And interpreters and translators play a huge role in helping to establish this language justice. So your role in achieving justice for our clients is critical. Let's talk a little bit more about those clients. So NIJC's clients and the people that you would most likely be working with, as the name suggests, are almost 100% immigrants. They are also usually at 200% or below of the federal poverty line. Many of them will have fled or still be actively in situations of trauma or high stress. We are going to talk a little bit later about what that can look like or mean in an interview setting. And we also have trainings that are geared a little bit more towards attorneys, but may be helpful for you in working with clients who may have that. But for right now, it's important to note that with clients who are facing a lot of emotional, physical trauma, it may be particularly important to establish trust with them, to make sure that they see you as a trustworthy person. Their emotional or physical reactions to conversations that you're having, bringing up difficult subjects might look really different from what you might expect. People can react a number of different ways when talking or having to relive these really difficult moments and conversations that they have to in order to make sure their immigration applications are complete. That makes the key in all of these situations, particularly as the interpreter, is to maintain an air of non-judgment. So not saying anything like, are you really sure that happened, or any of that. But then also as an interpreter, since mostly you're going to be using somebody else's words, nonverbal cues. So making sure that your tone of voice isn't accusatory, making sure that you're not rolling your eyes. This one's hard for some of us because we just kind of default to it, but making sure your arms aren't crossed and that you are sort of having an open disposition towards the client. There also may be different comfort levels as far as literacy, tech literacy, and knowledge of professional norms. This is hopefully something that the attorney that you're working with also knows, but as the interpreter, you should also might have a little extra insight, might be able to tell if a client wants something read aloud to them, if the tech instructions make sense, or if they're like, I actually have never sent an email with an attachment, how do you do that? And you can help communicate that to the attorney. Especially some of y'all that work in really fancy law offices, where you have to interact with front desk staff and building staff, or just be in these really fancy, polished professional spaces can be really uncomfortable. I know I've felt a little panicked sometimes in them. So making sure that folks know what to expect as they're sort of coming into the building, interacting with different people, that they know all the different steps of who they're going to talk to. Again, this is something that your attorney should know, but if they don't, it's probably a good idea to remind them. Some clients may also, if you could go to the next slide. Some clients may also be relatively comfortable in English, but still require interpretation because legal cases, legal language are really complex. They feel more comfortable in their other language. And other clients may speak nearly no English and need interpretation at every step of the way. We see a really wide variety in English ability with our clients. And there are things in each of these scenarios that can make things just different things to look out for in each scenario. So for someone who's more comfortable in English, you will probably not have to do as much of the like meeting coordinating, logistics, planning, things like that, that are involved in working with someone. But because immigration court requires individuals to make a choice between having an interpreter or doing their case in English, it's also really important for the client to get used to working with an interpreter. And that's where your role is particularly important. You can make sure that they are giving time to allow you to interpret so that they're used to doing that. You can make sure that they're not switching back and forth between their language and English. And so that's one of the things that like you can really help someone prepare for being in court, being in a more official interview as the interpreter. That's obviously not so much an issue for someone who has very little familiarity with English. They're not going to be tempted to suddenly start speaking in English. But what may be an issue that comes up is that they are going to need more support from you as far as the logistics and the planning of when are we going to meet next? What documents do you need from me? And doing all the kind of little sort of housekeeping-y tasks around helping them and their attorney communicate. And so just knowing kind of where your client is, being ready to step in different ways or scenarios. And there are people who are, you know, on either end of the spectrum and also somewhere in the middle. And so kind of feel out that relationship and look for the different ways that you are able to step in. All right. One of the ways that we can ensure that our interpretation is really contributing to language justice, that we are doing a good job, that we are providing the best service that we can, is to follow a code of ethics. So these are just some of the really big basic things. Don't add, subtract, or change anything. As you're speaking, try your hardest to interpret what's being said as they say it, like in the same way that they say it. This can include side comments, questions, requests for explanation, etc. It can also mean using the same level or intensity of language. If someone is cursing, you should communicate that. If they say something is heartbreaking, you shouldn't say that it's sad. And I know that that translation is rarely ever like a one-to-one conversion. And that interpretation especially can go really, really fast and you're making a lot of decisions. And so this part of the code of ethics is really about doing the best you can and trying to be scrupulous about doing your best to transmit every part of someone's speech kind of as they're saying it in the way they're saying it. Number 2 is to represent your qualifications and any doubts that you have accurately and timely. If you're volunteering and this is one of your first times doing this work, let both the attorney and the client know. If you are having trouble keeping up, or if there is something that they could be doing to be making your life easier, let them know. If a word or a phrase comes up in the conversation that you are unsure about, ask for clarification. Let both people know that you are asking for that clarification for yourself and not for either of them. You may be able to look it up if you have resources at hand, but still be sure that you address it. Also, if you and the client, you come into the room, you sit down and you realize that you are from different regions, you speak different dialects, or for whatever reason, you are just having a hard time understanding one another, also really important to flag right away. You should be impartial and avoid conflicts of interest or the appearance of them. This includes, again, the stuff we talked about earlier about refraining from passing judgment on the client, either through words or facial expressions, just being professional and warm with them, but not really biased in any way. Next one is that your meetings with your clients are confidential. Like the attorneys, your meetings with clients are bound by confidentiality. You shouldn't be sharing case details or any identifying information with outside parties. If you've worked with NIJC before with one of our in-house attorneys, you'll know that you are sometimes asked to sign a confidentiality agreement. Some of our pro bonos do this, some of our pro bono partners don't, but you are still, regardless of whether you sign anything, really bound by this idea of confidentiality. It really helps build trust with the client, and it's just an important part of legal work. However, in your process of working with NIJC, you may also get the opportunity to comment or to speak out about new rules in your capacity as an interpreter who has worked with an affected population. So we have this saying, what's said here stays here, what we learn here leaves here. So there are ways to talk about the work that you do with us that focuses on who you are and the relationships that you're building, as opposed to like the details of the cases of the people you've met. And we want to encourage you that if you're given that opportunity, we really love having our volunteers and pro bonos help us in our advocacy work as well. And then finally, stick to your role. When you are an interpreter, you're there to do just that. It's not your job to provide legal advice, to express opinions, any of that. You should not be the one who's explaining any questions that the client has. Always pass those right along to the attorney. Depending on who you're working or how you're working, you also may want to ask that your direct contact info not be passed along to the client, or that if it is, you're always sort of in a group chat, group email situation with the client and the attorney. You don't want to be in a position of a client coming to you and asking for legal advice, or kind of being an intermediary in that relationship in any way other than like a linguistic one. And we're going to talk a little bit more about establishing boundaries in the attorney-client-interpreter relationship, but this is something that's really important and is really easy to sort of brush past when you're sort of in the middle of talking to someone or helping with someone. So then prep work. There are a couple of different things that I found make interpreting sessions go a little easier. And so the first one is to ask for a pre-meeting with the attorney for information and prep. So things And you can just exchange like very basic information. This can be a couple of days before your session. This can be via email. This can be 15 minutes before the client walks in the door. Things you might want to ask are the client's name and their spelling. Ask for copies of the forms that the attorney will be reviewing. If these are, blank forms that are available on the internet, you can download those for yourself or ask for printouts if you're in person. If you're reviewing an affidavit or something else that has confidential client information, I know that some of our attorneys will share their screen with the interpreter so that they can be seeing the affidavit and be able to sort of sight translate for the client as opposed to having to listen, interpret, and then speak it out. So just make sure you have a plan for any documents that you're going to be reviewing. You also might want to ask about sensitive or difficult topics that the attorney thinks might come up in the case. The attorney may not know ahead of time, but it can be really helpful to ask if they know about anything that they can predict so that you can prepare yourself, decide if this is an assignment you want to take, sort of know what's coming up. They may not always know, but it's helpful to know ahead of time what everyone else in the room knows. And then make sure that you know whether you're working telephonically or in person. Hopefully you'll figure that out before then, but always good to double check. I also always like to spend a little bit of time making yourself a vocab list of terms you think might come up. So these can be legal terms, they can be terms related to items on the case if you already have a little bit of a narrative around it. It's okay if you don't have everything you need or if something unexpected comes up. This is just a little extra help. Making the list will also help you remember the words better, like the very act of writing them out. And this will also be easier the more cases you do. You'll figure out what words trip you up. I always get messed up on law enforcement for whatever reason. Every time I translate it, it's like drawing a blank every time. And specific words within individual cases and legal terms that come up a fair amount in an interview, you'll be able to like know what those are. And then how to set up your space. So I have here if we could go to the next slide, sorry. I have here a little diagram of what your desk might look like if you are doing a phone interpretation. And I think that your desk would probably look pretty similarly if you were doing an in-person interpretation, maybe minus the phone. So I really recommend having a beverage on hand. You are going to be talking a lot. And so having a little water, a little tea with honey, something like that to just be able to make sure that you are physically comfortable is really, really important. If you have mints or gum or anything like that that you can use to ground yourself during difficult moments that you can offer to clients, that can also help with just like keeping you physically comfortable and can be better as you, if there's like a difficult moment. You want to make sure that if you're doing this on a cell phone, that it is well charged and that you are in a quiet space with no other sounds or distractions. If you're doing a telephonic interpretation, and sometimes if you're doing an in-person one too, it depends on the setting, I would check with your attorney. You can also have your computer with your glossary or even an online dictionary pulled up so that you can look up words you aren't sure of on the fly. Copies of any immigration forms that you might be reviewing and note-taking materials. And we'll talk a little bit more about note-taking in a little bit. So at the beginning of the meeting, it may be helpful for you to start with an intro sort of blurb that you deliver in both languages. Your attorney may also introduce you, but it can be helpful to have a list of things that you want both the client and the attorney to know so that you can cover anything that the attorney doesn't get to. So I have a sample one here. Hello, my name is Alejandra Oliva, and I'll be interpreting for you in English and Spanish today. I'm a volunteer interpreter with the National Immigrant Justice Center. During this session, please speak directly to the client/attorney, depending on who you're talking to. I will interpret everything you say as you say it. It's helpful to me if you speak in short sentences and pause frequently so I can interpret accurately and carefully, and I'll raise my hand or break in if you're on the phone as a signal if I need you to pause. Everything I say and hear in this meeting will be kept confidential. Can you understand me? So then let's break that down into its sort of constituent parts. So start with your name, who you are. You can ask the attorney and client for their names as well. Your languages, make sure that you are in the right place. If the client actually feels more comfortable in a different language or didn't actually request a translator, this is a good check to have. Make sure that everybody knows that you're supposed to be there. If you have one, a organizational affiliation, it can be really helpful for the attorney to know if you're working with a service on your own, who you're with, and with a client, it can help build trust in you as a professional. Who to speak to, speaking to each other. So it's really important for the attorney and client to build trust with each other, because you may not be in every meeting, you will almost certainly not be in court. And so it's important for the client and the attorney to build up that kind of rapport and confidence that comes from talking directly to each other. There's going to be, some looking around to other people as they're speaking, but if the attorney is asking a question, they should be directly addressing the client and not talking to you. It's going to feel weird at first, I'm not going to lie, it's very funny, but it's just like a really helpful habit to get into for later court dates. The next thing is what you will do. Establish your norms as an interpreter, letting them know that what you're there to do is key and will help avoid surprises when you start translating side conversations or comments, things like that. What you need. This is just a sample script, and so this can vary from interpreter to interpreter, situation to situation. You'll learn more about what you need as you practice, but these are kind of some guidelines that I would recommend as you start. Confidentiality is good to remind the client of and will help build trust with them. And a comprehension check. It's always critical to make sure you and the client and the attorney can all understand each other. And especially in a situation that can be really high stress for a client, like a legal meeting where they're not sure if their case is going to get taken on or what's going to happen. I really like to give people the opportunity to confirm rather than assuming that they'll speak up if they don't actually understand me. So then while you're interpreting, take notes. You can take notes, scribble things down as you're listening to each person speaking. This can be really helpful in your recall and can help you interpret better. However, notes are also, will usually contain confidential information about the case because that's what you're going over. So make sure that it's okay with the client and attorney that you are taking notes. You can include it in your intro blurb. And then you should plan to destroy your notes immediately after the session or turn them over to the attorney in case they want to look at them. But your notes are likely to be not a full transcript of the meeting, kind of messy, meant to help you out. So you may just end up realizing that they're not worth keeping. Use first person and remind others to do so when possible. Part of translating exactly what someone says as they say it includes using first person when they do. Avoid using phrases like, she said that this and that happened, or he wants to know what happened when this other thing. This feels really awkward when you're first starting out, and you may need reminding, your attorney may need reminding not to say things like, can you ask her about this or that? But it really helps to establish that the conversation is between the client and the attorney and not between the client and the translator or the attorney and the translator. If you do have to use first person to refer to like your actual self, make sure that that's verbally clear. Hold on, quick translator question. What does this mean? Or hold on, I need a minute to catch up on interpreting. Things like that, where it's very, very clear that it's coming from you. Don't try to clarify or explain things on your own. If there's a question or a doubt, translate the question back to the attorney. Sometimes when interpreters will try to clarify or rephrase the question, they may inadvertently change it. This is especially important during preparations for a merits hearing, where these are questions that may get asked later on. If the wording is confusing for your client, the attorney will want to know which part was confusing so that they can ask it in a more understandable way in the future. And then it happens to the best of us. What happens when you draw a blank? Sometimes you're in the flow, you reach for a word, and it's just not there. Some strategies to sort of get yourself over the hump are to use expansion. So instead of saying furniture, you can say the chairs, the tables, the dressers in the room. Contraction is the reverse of that. If someone's, listing out a list of things that they're doing, you just say furniture instead of chairs, tables, dressers. You can define the term. So like I said earlier, I always struggle with law enforcement as a phrase. So instead of saying law enforcement, you would say those who ensure laws are followed, the police, and kind of fill in the blank that way. And then a quick decision. So depending on what the term is, you pick something and roll with it. So for example, instead of saying queen bee, you end up saying mother bee in the heat of the moment. Someone still understands what you mean, but it's not like totally precise. It's not the language most people use. Note that in a legal case, especially if the term ends up being important or it's getting repeated a lot, it's really worthwhile to take your time, interject, figure out exactly what the best translation is, because you don't want to be glossing over or like continually mistranslating something that ends up being really important to what you're talking about. And then the final strategy is to do just that, to ask the speaker for an explanation or elaboration. And if you're going to be doing that, be sure to like let the other party know, I don't know what this word they're saying means, I'm going to ask. Which leads us to the moments that you should intervene as the interpreter. So next slide. If you need an explanation, like we just talked about, it can feel really awkward to pause or have something explained like that, but it's really important that these terms are right during the legal explanation. So if you have any doubt, if it seems like it's going to be important, if it seems like it is important, stop, ask the question. You need a speaker to repeat something. You didn't catch the end of a sentence, there was mumbling, a fire alarm went off in the middle of someone's conversation, whatever, you can say, sorry, I didn't catch that. Can you say that again? And then the final one is when a speaker is not pausing for interpretation. This will probably happen a lot at the beginning of your conversation when people are still getting used to sort of the different rhythm that an interpreted conversation has. But it can also happen a lot if someone is recounting something that is emotional or difficult. If you're able to, if you're in person, start with a nonverbal indicator, whatever you mentioned in your intro. But if need be, or if you're on the phone, you should gently verbally interrupt and kind of remind the speaker that you need to be able to interpret and they're going too fast for you. This is not going to feel great. It goes against a lot of conversational norms that we have, but it's more important for you to be able to accurately interpret their entire remarks and to capture the fullness of their story than to not interrupt them. And so that's something to keep in mind, even as you're like, I cannot possibly break into this person's conversation who is really upset. It's really important for you to be able to get that and to interpret it as best you can. And that's a lot easier when you're just getting little snippets of text. Which leads us to our next point, trauma and the interpretation section. And I've seen some questions about this in the chat already, and I'd be glad to take questions about this at the end. But sometimes client stories, especially when we're translating for people who are in our own community, who share our same cultural past, can feel really, really personal or reflect our own stories in ways that are challenging, that interact with our own trauma. Or you might not have experienced anything like this client, and their stories are just really, really difficult to hear and respond to. Like I said earlier, this is one of the reasons I think it's a good idea to meet with the attorney before your client session and ask about the outlines of the case. If there's something in their story that you can already tell is going to be difficult or triggering, especially if there's a long lead time, it's totally okay to ask that they look for someone else to do this interpretation. If you just need a little bit of time to sort of prepare yourself for what's going to happen, you also have that time to prepare. Sometimes though, even if you have asked these questions, if you have tried to prepare as best you can, things can come up that you are not anticipating talking about. And as an interpreter, this can be especially tricky because you are both present in the room as someone who is listening and responding and kind of part of the conversation, but you're also not really participating in the conversation as yourself. You are interpreting, you sort of passing language from one side to another, but you're not really in it as yourself. So I think it's important to note, first of all, that you can ask for breaks as you need them. You need to be in a good space to translate well. And if that is not happening for you in this conversation, or if you realize that you need a drink of water or a breather, you can absolutely ask for that. You can also, like I said, bring in a bottle of water, some chewing gum, some mints, something that can help you sort of ground yourself, bring yourself back into your body. You can do breathing exercises. I also really recommend making a self-care plan for yourself for after interpretation, whether that looks like taking a walk to get a coffee or making sure that you have good mental health care. All of these things can be really important. And, you know, it's really important for you to listen to yourself and your body as you're doing this, because you can't help anyone if you're going through a really hard time yourself. And then this is something that goes sort of outside of a lot of the official ethics codes that I've just been talking about. But I find that responding to the client directly before you begin translating something that was really difficult or that it took them a lot to share can be really helpful to helping you feel like a human person and not just like a translating robot. Saying something really short and non-judgmental. Thank you so much for sharing. I'm so sorry that happened to you. That sounds really hard. Like I said, not responding can make you feel like a robot and can make the client feel like their story hasn't really been heard. So just being able to like take that beat and interact with them as a human being can be really, really helpful for you, for the client, for everyone. All right, do's and don'ts. So do mirror the language that the client uses to talk about themselves, their situation, their history, their experiences, especially when you're speaking to them in their own language, and do your best to mirror these distinctions in the target language as well. So language around queerness, around difficult or traumatic experiences, even around like relationships, switching partner and husband, referring to someone as queer when they've been calling themselves a lesbian throughout the entire interview, things like that are things that you want to watch out for and avoid, and instead just use the same words that the client uses. If you're not sure about terms and whether they're offensive, try to look them up before your next meeting or during the meeting if you have the resources at hand. Do set expectations and boundaries around your work and availability. You are a volunteer, but that doesn't mean that all of your off or even your work hours are up for grabs. Set expectations with the attorney that you're working with early in the relationship and enforce those boundaries as needed. So I won't be able to translate that document on the weekend. I only work during my normal work hours. I would love to work with you on this case, but I have a report due on the 26th, and so I'll have limited availability around then. If you are a professional staff interpreter at one of our pro bono partner firms, you do not need to give your personal cell phone, personal email information to either the client or the attorney. If you're coming in as sort of an individual volunteer, like that's how you're going to stay in touch. But you, in any case, you should say, you know, this is my work email or this is my personal email, but I'm only going to be responding to emails about these cases from X to Y times. Be sure that's reasonably fast and everything, but also it is very easy for cases like this to suddenly take up more and more and more of your time. And so, again, we really want to keep you guys feeling good about interpreting and feeling good about being a part of this work. And so if you need to or want to set boundaries around how or when you'll communicate, that's really important, and you should absolutely be doing that. You should also always have the attorney included in any communication that you have with the client. So really discourage them from reaching out to you directly. If they need to text, email, whatever, have them do it in a group WhatsApp, send the email to both of you, whatever is possible, so that you are not the primary point of contact for that client. And then establish whether you'll be interested in working on the case longer term, or if you'd rather just work on a single interpretation session, depending on what you have time, what the attorney's need is, all of that. And then also, and again, if you're early in your interpretation journey, explain this to both the attorney and your client and ask for accommodations as you need them. Don't pass judgment or share opinions on the client. We've talked a lot about why that's important. And it's a key to establishing trust with the client and is a way to keep close to ethical guidelines, but it also applies to conversations with the attorney after the session. So try not to discuss the client outside of their presence. And don't have side conversations. If both the client and the attorney are present in the room, you should be interpreting everything each of them say and being really clear with the client. I mean, there's going to be stuff that comes up like, where's the bathroom in this office? That might end up being a side conversation, but in general, try to do that. And then, as we talked about earlier, stick to one language. That's going to be really important for the client as they get closer to the case. That's going to be really important for the client as they get closer to their court date. And as a result, you just want to make sure that they're really well practiced in working with an interpreter, sticking to speaking in the language that you're interpreting for, not breaking into English if possible. And those are all the tips and tricks I have. I am going to leave you with a quote from an NIJC client, Helen. I know what my life has been. My story is true and I can express it and retell it 1,000 times. But when it came to fill out a form or navigate this new system, I wouldn't have been able to do it. These forms are also so hard because the words are so different from the way that people normally speak. And if you don't even know the language well, it's so much harder. So Helen is a client who I believe has won asylum now, and she's doing really well, and she would not have been able to do that without interpreters and NIJC and pro bono staff and attorneys. And so that is what makes this work important, what's really exciting about it, and we really hope that you will sign up to volunteer. Thank you so much for coming.
I forgot to unmute. Minor detail. Alejandra, it's always so great to hear from you and your experiences in interpreting. We really value all that you have done within the interpretation community. We're now going to open it up to questions and curiosities. And before I stop the recording, I did want to just answer one really great and basic question that we probably should have led off with for the folks that are not familiar with NIJC and the type of work that we do, and you might be seeing this as an opportunity to get involved. So Chris, thanks for asking those questions about what types of cases and the range of time that could be expected. I'll just kind of start by answering this, and Alejandra, please jump in if you have other experiences. But at NIJC, our pro bono program, there's a multitude of opportunities to get involved. The majority of, I shouldn't say the majority, we have a large number of asylum cases. So asylum is for individuals that are fleeing persecution from their home country and coming to the United States for protection. Within the asylum seekers, there are LGBT community members that are fleeing because of their LGBT being part of the LGBT community. We also deal with other types of protection and individuals that are seeking relief here in the United States, such as individuals that have suffered from domestic violence or, are trying to leave a violent family situation. We are working with individuals that have suffered a crime committed to them here in the United States. We work with individual, families, adults, children of all ages. We have a program that works with children that were unaccompanied when they came to this country. They now have a guardian and they are fighting to stay in the country because the court has determined it's not in their best interest to return to their country due to abuse, abandonment, or neglect. So while all of these cases are legal in nature and they are talking about a legal form of protection, oftentimes the stories that they are telling have a range of topics, right? It might be at a school setting where they suffered harm or persecution. It might be, a job where they suffered, trafficking, human trafficking. It might be, there's a range of situations, and so a range of vocabulary that's also necessary. That being said, about the other question about the range of time, immigration cases are long cases. They can be long cases. That doesn't mean that you have to be involved in the whole case. So every situation is different. Every project is different. Every client and every attorney will have different expectations, as you might as well also, depending on when in your life you're being contacted to interpret. So sometimes, like Alejandra mentioned, you might just, be involved for one-time interpretation or translation. We often, though, where possible, would like, for attorneys that don't speak Spanish, for example, and they know they have a Spanish-speaking client that might last a couple months or even a couple years, they might say, hey, we'll have a couple interpreters that are working with this client, and you get to know the client, you get to know the interpreter. And that way there's not so many introductions. You don't have to go through the basics. You really do establish a relationship if that's possible and of interest of the volunteers. So depending on if you work at a law firm or if you're doing this from the community, there's a variety of situations you can get involved with. I hope that answers the question, but Alejandra, please also, anything else to add?
No, I think that all makes a lot of sense. These are generally going to be legal cases, but there is sometimes, overlap into the medical, into the educational as well. And I think as far as possible scenarios, Ellen is pretty right about the different kinds of cases that we have and the different kinds of stories that come up in our interpretation sessions. I'm not sure about how often interpretation is via phone. I think it really depends on who the client is and where they're at, where the interpreter lives, things like that. And so I think I want to say it's a pretty even mix, but I'm not positive about that.
Yeah, I'm going to stop the recording now so that we can jump into some Q&A a little bit more freely here.